The morning sun was just beginning to spill over the ridge when Daniel Crowley stepped onto his porch, coffee steaming in his hand. From his hilltop property, the valley below glimmered with dew, and his pride, the Crowley Dam, stood like a stone guardian over the landscape. Built with his own hands over 7 years, the dam had turned a trickling creek into a serene lake. To him, it wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of perseverance, of independence from the very people who had spent years trying to control him, the Maplewood Lakes Homeowners Association. Daniel wasn't a rich man, but he was stubborn. When he first bought the old farm outside Maplewood 10 years ago, everyone had laughed. The land was dry, the soil infertile, and the HOA had declared it non-compliant because he refused to pay for their landscaping fees or use their contractors. He didn't care. He built his house himself, restored the barn, and, against all warnings, redirected the seasonal stream through his property, creating the dam that gave him peace, privacy, and power. That peace, however, had been cracking, just like the trust between him and the HOA board. For months, letters had piled up in his mailbox. Final notice. Violation fee due. HOA legal action pending. They claimed Daniel owed nearly $9,000 in unpaid community maintenance fees, even though his property wasn't connected to their sewer lines or roads. He had ignored them at first. Then he'd written letters of his own, quoting property law, water rights, and state codes. None of it mattered. To the HOA, Daniel wasn't a neighbor, he was a threat to their authority. That morning, as he stood watching ducks glide across the lake, a low rumble of engines pulled his attention to the dirt road below. He squinted. 3 trucks were making their way up, one of them towing a bulldozer. His stomach tightened. He already knew who it was. The convoy stopped at his front gate. Out stepped Nancy Whitaker, the HOA president, a short, sharp-eyed woman in a cream blazer and sunglasses that seemed too expensive for the neighborhood. Behind her, 2 board members and a hired demolition crew waited impatiently, their orange vests bright against the brown dust. "Mr. Crowley," she called, voice already thick with authority. "We've sent you 6 notices and 2 certified letters. This is your final enforcement action." Daniel set his coffee down slowly. "You can't be serious," he said, walking down the path toward them. "You're trespassing." "This property is within Maplewood jurisdiction," Nancy said, handing him a clipboard. "You owe substantial unpaid fees, and your unauthorized structure, what you call a dam, is in violation of Section 4B of the Neighborhood Safety Code." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This isn't your jurisdiction. My property sits outside the HOA boundary. I've told you that 3 times, in writing." She smiled like a lawyer who'd already won. "Our legal counsel disagrees. And so does the county inspector." Behind her, a man in a tan uniform, clearly from the county, shifted uneasily. "Sir," he said, "the structure's on a shared waterway. It technically falls under community regulation." "Shared waterway?" Daniel scoffed. "You mean the creek that didn't even exist until I cleared it out myself?" Nancy turned to her men. "Proceed." Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. "Touch that dam," he shouted, "and you'll regret it." The bulldozer's engine roared to life. He ran to block their path, arms outstretched. "You have no right. You'll flood the lower valley." Nancy crossed her arms. "Then maybe next time you'll pay your dues." For a moment, everything froze, the distant birdsong, the buzz of cicadas, the ripple of water behind the dam. Then, with one crushing motion, the bulldozer's steel blade slammed into the wall of stone. The sound was sickening. Concrete groaned and cracked like thunder. Water began to leak, thin at first, then faster, louder, unstoppable. "Stop it!" Daniel yelled. He grabbed a shovel, waving frantically, but the operator didn't even look at him. Another hit, and another. The cracks widened, spilling streams that merged into a torrent. By the time Daniel reached the base, the dam was bleeding water like an open wound. "Shut it down!" the county inspector screamed, suddenly realizing the force they'd unleashed. But it was too late. The wall burst. A roaring surge exploded forward, swallowing the dry creek bed and tearing down the valley. Mud, rock, and tree roots churned together as the wave raced toward the very neighborhood that had ordered its destruction. Daniel stood frozen, soaked and trembling, as the lake emptied before his eyes. The water he'd spent years collecting, gone in minutes. Nancy stumbled backward, mud splashing her white blazer. "What have you done?" she shrieked. Daniel's voice came low, hollow. "You did this." Hours later, the sun began to dip behind the ridge again. Daniel sat on the ruins of his dam, staring down at the valley where Maplewood's perfect lawns and symmetrical houses had once stood. Now, it looked like a war zone. Streets had become rivers. Cars were half buried in mud. The HOA clubhouse, where Nancy had held her smug board meetings, was a twisted heap of wood and glass. Sirens wailed in the distance. Emergency crews waded through waist-deep water, shouting orders. Somewhere down there, Nancy's cream blazer floated in the muck like a ghost of authority. Daniel didn't smile. There was no satisfaction, no triumph. Only silence, and the cold realization that nature, once unleashed, didn't care about rules, boundaries, or fees. He picked up a chunk of stone from the dam, turning it in his hand. His reflection flickered in the shallow puddle beside him. In that reflection, he didn't see a victim. He saw the man they had turned into a storm. And the storm had answered. The next morning, Maplewood wasn't a neighborhood anymore, it was a swamp. Helicopters hovered above the wreckage, their blades slicing the misty air as reporters shouted over the roar. The smell of wet earth, sewage, and gasoline hung heavy, and the once perfect lawns that had been the pride of the HOA were buried under a thick coat of brown sludge. Daniel Crowley stood behind the yellow police tape, arms crossed, his clothes still streaked with mud. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night giving his statement to emergency crews, though no one seemed to believe his version of events. They all wanted someone to blame, and he was the easiest target. A deputy approached him. "Mr. Crowley," he said, looking uneasy, "the county engineer wants to talk to you again. They're saying your dam wasn't up to code." Daniel let out a low, bitter laugh. "It wasn't supposed to be your code. It was private property." The deputy hesitated. "Well, the HOA's saying you built it illegally. They claim they warned you it was dangerous." Daniel turned his gaze toward the wreckage below. The HOA's dangerous structure had held firm for 7 years without a single crack or leak, until they brought a bulldozer. "Let me guess," he said. "They didn't mention who tore it down." The deputy didn't answer. He just scratched his neck and walked away, muttering something about pending investigations. By noon, news vans lined the main road. Reporters buzzed like flies around the HOA president, Nancy Whitaker, who stood in front of the flooded remains of Maplewood. Her immaculate hair was gone. Instead, her curls were frizzed, her makeup smudged. But her voice carried the same brittle confidence. "This tragedy could have been avoided," she declared into the microphones. Mr. Crowley refused to cooperate with community safety standards. His unauthorized dam. Daniel's voice cut through from the crowd. "My unauthorized dam? You mean the one you destroyed?" The cameras swung toward him like predators catching new prey. Nancy stiffened. "Sir, you had multiple violations." "I had a dam that worked." Daniel barked. "You tore it down because I wouldn't pay for your stupid landscaping fees, and now your whole neighborhood's underwater." The crowd murmured. One reporter raised her mic. "Mrs. Whitaker, is that true? Did the HOA authorize the demolition?" Nancy hesitated, just long enough for doubt to spread. "Our contractors acted under county approval," she said finally, too quickly. Daniel shook his head. "There was no county approval. I checked the permits months ago." "You forged it, didn't you?" "Mr. Crowley, that's a serious accusation," she snapped. "So is trespassing," he shot back. The tension crackled between them, electric and raw. Cameras flashed. Nancy tried to compose herself, but Daniel could see the tremor in her hands. She knew the truth, and now, everyone else would too. That night, Daniel sat on his porch again, the silence around him heavier than before. The dam was gone, and with it, the lake. What remained was a scar, both in the land and inside him. He turned on the local news, and there she was again, Nancy, trying to spin the story. The HOA acted in good faith, she said, her voice measured. We had no way of knowing the dam's structural integrity. But this time, a new voice cut in. A reporter named Kelly Harper had interviewed a county clerk who confirmed what Daniel already knew: no permit had ever been filed. The so-called county inspector who accompanied the demolition team? He wasn't even an active employee. Daniel leaned back, exhaling. Finally, a crack in their armor. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Crowley, a woman's voice said. This is Kelly Harper from Channel 9 News. I'd like to hear your side of the story, on camera. He paused. You think people want to hear about a stubborn farmer versus an HOA? I think, she said, people love hearing about justice. He almost laughed. Justice? That's a word the HOA paved over years ago. Still, he agreed. 2 days later, Daniel stood in front of Kelly's camera crew. The sunlight bounced off the wrecked valley behind him. His voice was calm, but his eyes were tired. I built that dam because this land was dying, he said. I wanted to make something beautiful, something that lasted. The HOA didn't like that they couldn't control it. So they called it a violation. And when I wouldn't pay their fees, they destroyed it. Kelly nodded. And you warned them it would flood? 3 times. In writing. They laughed at me. Her cameraman zoomed in on his face. And what do you want now? She asked. Daniel looked out at the muddy ruins below. Not revenge, he said. Just the truth. The interview aired that evening. It spread fast, first across local channels, then online. People were outraged. Hashtags popped up overnight. #CrowlerDam, #HOA Justice, #Sank Maplewood. Nancy tried to respond, but the internet had already chosen its villain. Videos of the bulldozer smashing the dam went viral, captured by someone's cell phone. Every frame showed exactly what Daniel had described, the HOA ordering the destruction while he shouted warnings in the background. By morning, Nancy's lawyer had quit. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover the damage, citing gross negligence. But Daniel wasn't celebrating. For every person cheering him online, there were still those calling him reckless, unstable, even vengeful. They said he must have sabotaged the dam himself. That he let it fail out of spite. The truth, Daniel realized, didn't matter as much as who owned the narrative. And right now, both sides were fighting for it. That night, a knock echoed on Daniel's door. He opened it to find a man in a dark suit, tall, expressionless, holding a folder. Mr. Crowley, the man said, flashing a badge. I'm with the State Water Commission. We need to talk about the incident. Daniel stepped aside, his pulse quickening. The man looked around the cabin, then opened the folder. We've reviewed your records. You did file a water management claim years ago, but it was rejected due to lack of community impact studies. Daniel frowned. So technically, the man said, your dam was unregistered. That complicates liability. We're also investigating who authorized the demolition, but until then. He slid a document across the table. You're being named as a co-responsible party for the flood damage. Daniel's stomach dropped. You can't be serious. They destroyed it. I didn't. Mr. Crowley, the man interrupted. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to inform you, the HOA is suing you for $12.4 million. The words hit like another wave crashing through the valley. As the official left, Daniel sank into his chair, staring at the paper. The legal jargon blurred together: liability, negligence, restitution. It didn't make sense. He'd lost everything, and somehow, they still wanted more. He looked out the window toward the ruins of the dam. The night was quiet again, too quiet. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the anger, a flicker of something else began to stir, not revenge, but resolve. If they wanted a fight, they were about to see how a man who built a dam with his bare hands could take one down without lifting a shovel. The lawsuit hit Daniel like a thunderclap. $12.4 million, a number so big it didn't even feel real. It was enough to crush anyone, especially a man with a small farm, no lawyer, and no faith left in the system. But Daniel Crowley wasn't anyone. He was the kind of man who built a dam from rocks and dirt because no one believed he could. And now, he was going to build something else, a case. The first thing he did was drive down to the Maple County Courthouse. The clerk at the front desk recognized him instantly, the dam guy, as the news had started calling him. She avoided eye contact when he asked for copies of all permits, demolition orders, and correspondence related to the HOA's action. "I'm not sure I can release all of that," she said, tapping nervously at her keyboard. "Then get someone who can," he replied, leaning forward just enough to make her stop hesitating. She printed a thick stack of documents. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered. Daniel flipped through the pages as he walked out into the sunlight. Halfway down the stack, one page caught his eye, a demolition permit, dated 3 weeks before the flood. It bore a signature from the county inspector, the same man who'd stood there that day. But there was one problem. The signature didn't match the real inspector's name on the county employee roster. Someone had forged it. Daniel took the papers straight to Kelly Harper, the reporter who had given him a voice when everyone else dismissed him. She listened carefully as he spread the documents across her desk, her pen tapping against her notebook. "This proves they falsified county authorization," he said. "The HOA forged the approval to make the demolition look legal." Kelly's eyes widened. "If that's true, that's not just negligence, that's criminal fraud." "I need people to see it," he said, "before they bury it." She nodded slowly. "Give me 48 hours. 2 days later, Channel 9 aired a news segment titled The Paper Trail, How Maplewood HOA Forged Its Own Authority. Kelly stood in front of the county courthouse, holding up copies of the falsified permits. The screen cut to an interview with the real county inspector, who confirmed that his signature had been stolen. "I wasn't even in the state that week," he said. "Whoever authorized that demolition used my credentials without consent." The story exploded. National outlets picked it up. Nancy Whitaker went from HOA president to public enemy number 1 overnight. But the storm was far from over. A week later, Daniel received a thick envelope in the mail, this time from the HOA's attorney, a man named Philip Greer. Greer was infamous for dragging out lawsuits until his opponents were bled dry. Inside the envelope was an offer. "Mr. Crowley, our client is willing to drop all charges in exchange for your public acknowledgement of fault and agreement to a non-disclosure clause. In return, the HOA will refrain from further litigation." Daniel read it twice. In plain English, confess and disappear. He folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Then he opened his laptop. If they wanted silence, he would give them the opposite. He uploaded every document, every forged permit, every notice, every email chain, to a new website he named mapleleaks.org. Within hours, it went viral. Whistleblowers from other neighborhoods began sending their own stories: illegal fees, fake violations, intimidation tactics. The comments poured in. "Same thing happened to my dad's property. HOAs think they're governments, finally someone's fighting back. This man deserves a medal, not a lawsuit." For the first time in months, Daniel felt something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. Meanwhile, the state attorney's office took notice. Investigators raided the HOA headquarters and seized computers, financial ledgers, and meeting records. What they found went beyond his dam: falsified invoices, kickbacks from contractors, and safety fines that had never been reported to the county. Nancy was arrested for fraud and conspiracy. The image of her being led away in handcuffs replayed across every local channel. When Daniel saw it, he didn't cheer. He just sat there quietly, remembering the day she'd ordered the bulldozer forward without hesitation. The same cold confidence in her eyes, now replaced by panic. Justice wasn't supposed to feel empty. But it did. A few weeks later, Kelly came to visit him again, this time without the cameras. "You did it," she said, handing him a folder. "The Attorney General's office is filing charges against the HOA board. You're officially cleared of liability." Daniel opened the folder. The words "case dismissed" looked almost unreal. He set it down, staring at the sunset spilling across the valley. The water hadn't returned, just cracked mud and broken trees. "They'll rebuild the neighborhood," he said quietly. "They always do." Kelly nodded. "But maybe not the way they used to." He smiled faintly. "Let's hope not." She hesitated before leaving. "You could sue them, you know. For property loss, emotional damages. You'd win." He shook his head. "No. I didn't build that dam to get rich. I built it to stop the land from dying. Money won't fix what they killed." That night, Daniel walked down the path to what used to be the edge of his lake. The moonlight glimmered on the wet soil. Somewhere beneath it, pieces of the dam still lay buried, stones he'd carried one by one, sweat and willpower shaping what others called impossible. He crouched, running his hand across the cold ground. "You held on as long as you could," he whispered. The wind carried the faint sound of water trickling, not from the dam, but from the mountain stream slowly finding its way back. Nature, relentless and patient, was healing itself. And maybe, Daniel thought, so was he. He took out his phone and recorded a short video for the thousands of people following his story. "They said I built something dangerous," he began. "Maybe I did, but not the dam. What scared them was the idea of a man they couldn't control. So they tore it down. And now the world knows what happens when power goes unchecked." He paused, glancing toward the distant lights of the ruined neighborhood. "You can rebuild a dam. You can't rebuild trust. Not easily. But you can start." He ended the video there. Within hours, it had millions of views. #HOA reform trended worldwide. In the coming weeks, legislators began drafting new bills to regulate HOA power. Several communities dissolved their associations entirely. Journalists called it the Crowley effect. Daniel didn't attend any interviews or protests. He stayed on his land, planting trees along the former lake bed. Slowly, the valley began to green again. And one morning, when rain clouds gathered over Maplewood, Daniel stood by the stream and watched as the water swelled, gentle this time, controlled, flowing exactly where it was meant to go. He smiled faintly. "That's enough," he said. "That's all it ever needed to be." The seasons rolled by quietly in Maplewood Valley. Winter came, cold and hollow, freezing the last of the floodwater into glassy sheets. By spring, grass began to rise again from the cracked mud, thin and defiant. The ruined neighborhood below had become a ghost town, roofs caved in, driveways half-buried, and fences leaning like broken ribs. The HOA signs, once pristine and full of warnings, now rusted and unreadable. Daniel Crowley watched it all from his porch. His once isolated farmhouse had become something else, a symbol. Reporters called it the house that stood when everything else fell. But Daniel didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man standing in the wreckage of other people's pride. For months, he'd been quiet. After the trials ended, after the HOA's collapse and Nance's conviction, people expected him to disappear. Instead, he stayed, planting saplings where the lake used to be, clearing debris by hand, rebuilding fences one post at a time. He didn't rebuild the dam. Not yet. Why not? People asked him. You could have a lake again. A fresh start. But Daniel would just shake his head. A dam isn't just stones and mortar. It's trust. And that's harder to rebuild than concrete. One rainy afternoon, a familiar car pulled up his dirt driveway. It was Kelly Harper, the reporter who had stood by him from the beginning. She stepped out, wearing boots and a trench coat, her hair damp from the drizzle. "Still no dam?" she asked, smiling softly. Daniel chuckled. "Guess I'm waiting for the land to forgive me first." Kelly handed him a folder. "You might want to see this." Inside were blueprints, county-approved, stamped, and signed. The state wants to fund a new ecological project here, she explained. A reservoir, managed by a public trust. They want your input. Said no one knows this land better than you. Daniel ran a hand over the pages. The diagrams showed not just a dam, but an entire water management system, wetlands, filtration ponds, natural levees. It wasn't a vanity project, it was restoration. I don't know, he murmured. I'm not much of a committee man. Kelly smiled. Maybe not. But you're the reason they even care enough to start one. He looked up toward the clouds, feeling the soft patter of rain on his face. The land was thirsty again. Maybe it was time. The following months brought quiet transformation. Teams of engineers, ecologists, and volunteers arrived. Some were locals, others from universities or environmental groups. They all knew Daniel by name, though many had never met him. At first, he kept his distance, watching as surveyors marked the soil and backhoes cleared the twisted remains of the old dam. But one morning, a young volunteer walked up to him, a girl barely 20. "Mr. Crowley," she said shyly. "My parents used to live down there. We lost everything in the flood, but they said you tried to stop it. So, thank you." Daniel didn't know what to say. He just nodded. By noon, he was working beside them, hauling stones, planting willows along the banks, showing the team where the original creek had once curved. He didn't talk much, but his hands spoke for him, steady, patient, deliberate. When the new structure finally began to take shape, it wasn't a dam in the old sense. It was alive, a series of natural terraces built from rock and soil, designed to slow the water, not stop it. It breathed with the land, not against it. They named it Crowley Basin. Daniel protested at first, but Kelly convinced him. "You built the first one," she said. "This one just carries your lesson." As the grand opening approached, the state governor came to tour the site. Reporters gathered, drones buzzed, and families who'd once fled Maplewood returned to see the valley reborn. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood behind the podium awkwardly, hat in hand, avoiding the cameras. "I'm not much for speeches," he began. "But I'll say this, I built something once because I thought I could control nature. Turns out, nature was the only one that ever knew what it was doing. Maybe that's the lesson we all missed. Control isn't power. Respect is." The crowd fell silent. Rain began to fall again, gentle, cleansing, steady. He looked down toward the water. "This valley took everything from me," he continued. "But it gave something back too, a chance to learn. And that's worth more than any dam." The audience applauded softly, not out of spectacle but respect. Kelly caught his eye and nodded, proud, teary, relieved. That night, when everyone had gone, Daniel stayed by the water. The new reservoir shimmered under the moonlight, its surface calm and endless. He walked along the bank, listening to frogs croak and crickets sing. The air was cool, fresh, the first time the valley had smelled like life in years. He sat down on a smooth stone, watching the reflection of the stars dance on the surface. For the first time since the flood, he felt peace, not the bitter silence of revenge, but the kind that comes from acceptance. Somewhere behind him, he heard footsteps. It was Kelly again, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might still be here," she said. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel replied. "Too quiet." They sat together, watching the water ripple. "Funny," Kelly said softly. "A dam destroyed a town, but it also brought people together." Daniel smiled faintly. "Water has a way of doing that. It divides, it heals. Depends on what you build around it." Kelly sipped her coffee. "And what will you build next?" He looked out over the valley, green fields, new streams, and a future that finally felt possible. "Something that lasts," he said. "Something honest." Months later, a new sign went up at the entrance of the valley. Crowley Basin Nature Preserve. Dedicated to the balance between man and nature. Children played near the shore. Families picnicked under young trees. Birds returned to the wetlands, nesting where there had once been wreckage. Daniel watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. The world had moved on, but it had remembered. He turned to leave, pausing for one last look at the water, calm, shimmering, alive. "Stay steady," he whispered. "You've earned your peace." The breeze carried his words across the surface, rippling outward, like a promise kept. And as he walked away, the clouds parted, and sunlight poured over the valley, golden, endless, forgiving. The dam was gone. But Daniel Crowley's story would flow forever.